What World War II can teach us today about money. Women became the CFOs of America overnight. War bonds replaced savings, and black markets thrived under everyone's nose. But how did families endure years of forced sacrifice? Watch closely, because the final lesson flips everything you thought about money. Chapter 1. Could you live on coupons instead of cash? You open your wallet, see a dollar bill, and realize it buys you nothing. Meat, sugar, even shoes, locked behind tiny ration slips. That was 1942 America. The government rolled out the Office of Price Administration's rationing system. And suddenly, money wasn't the key to survival. Ration books were. Without those stamps, you couldn't buy gasoline to get to work, nor sugar to bake bread for your kids' birthdays. Each family received ration books, color-coded, numbered, and fiercely tracked. A family of 4 in 1943 was allocated just 2 pounds of sugar per month, less than what a modern teen drinks in 2 days of soda. Gasoline was rationed too, just 3 gallons a week for ordinary households. That's barely enough for one round trip from Brooklyn to Queens today. People hoarded, cheated, and found loopholes. Black markets exploded. In New York City alone, authorities seized over 5 million counterfeit ration coupons in 1944. Housewives in Detroit whispered about meat men who sold steaks under the table for double the price. And yet, millions still stuck to their ration allotments because disobedience felt unpatriotic. Imagine the tension. You'd stand in a butcher's line for hours, ration book clutched tight, only to hear the woman ahead of you buy the last pound of hamburger. What would you do? Argue? Cry? Or head home to make victory stew, a thin broth of cabbage, onions, and potatoes, stretched across 3 meals? And the strange part? Despite the shortages, inflation stayed low. The government tied prices to ration coupons, so goods couldn't skyrocket unchecked. In fact, between 1942 and 1945, wartime inflation averaged only 3.5% a year, far below what economists feared. But at what cost to personal freedom? Because when the state controlled your sugar, your gas, and your shoes, did you really own your money anymore? And that brings us to the next puzzle. If coupons ruled daily life, why did Americans still pour billions into war bonds, a system even more controlling than ration books? Chapter 2. Why did people buy war bonds? Like we buy crypto today. Picture this. You're told not to spend your money, but to hand it over to the government instead. Why? Because victory depends on it. During World War II, Americans bought over $185 billion worth of war bonds, the equivalent of more than $3 trillion today. That wasn't charity. It was a financial lifeline for the war effort. The government needed money to build tanks, planes, and guns, and ordinary families were the lenders. Posters screamed, "Buy bonds or buy bullets." Movie stars like Rita Hayworth, Frank Sinatra, and even Bugs Bunny told you it was your patriotic duty. Kids collected coins for war stamps. A $25 bond cost just $18.75 and matured years later. But here's the twist. Inflation during the war often ate away the value, meaning many never really profited. So why did people still line up? Because not buying felt treasonous. One New York Times headline in 1944 warned, "The man who won't buy bonds helps Hitler." Think about that pressure. What would you do if your neighbor knew you hadn't bought your share? In some towns, war bond rallies turned into massive spectacles. In 1943, in Chicago's Soldier Field, more than 100,000 people gathered to hear speeches urging them to buy more. Elvis Presley later auctioned off his own Cadillac for war bonds. Even baseball teams paused games so fans could buy bonds in the stands. But here's the irony. At the same time, people were struggling under rationing. They had less sugar, less gas, less meat, yet they were giving their money away in exchange for a promise of payback years later. Would you? Could you tie up half your income in government bonds while you ration soap, bread, and gasoline? And if that sounds tough, wait until you see how women, suddenly running households and jobs at once, became the hidden generals of America's wartime economy. Chapter 3. How women quietly became the CEOs of wartime budgets. Imagine running a household with almost nothing on the shelves, and at the same time, working a factory job for the first time in your life. That's what millions of women faced in the 1940s. By 1945, 1 in every 4 married women worked outside the home. In total, over 6 million women entered the workforce during the war, double the pre-war figure. They weren't just sewing uniforms. They were building bombers, welding ships, and managing paychecks. But here's the kicker. At home, they also managed ration books. Each family got a limited number of stamps for essentials like sugar, coffee, gasoline, and meat. A pound of sugar cost just 9 cents, but no stamp meant no purchase. So mothers became strategists, deciding which Sunday dessert was worth a stamp, or whether to save sugar for canning fruit in the summer. One Illinois mother kept a diary in 1943. We had stew again. 3 carrots, 2 potatoes, 1 piece of beef. That is our meat for the week. Her children later recalled never seeing a full steak until after the war. Women also became masters of substitution. Butter was replaced with margarine, colored with yellow dye packets. Coffee shortages pushed families toward chicory or roasted barley brews. Nylon stockings disappeared. Nylon went to parachutes. So women painted seams down the backs of their legs with eyebrow pencils. On payday, women often directed where the money went. 10% was expected for war bonds, the rest for rent, coal, food, and kids' shoes. Some stretched a single dollar across a week with envelope systems, echoes of Depression-era survival. Here's a mind-bender. While men fought overseas, women managed 90% of household finances in America. For the first time in history, women had both wages and control of the home economy. And yet, not all money flowed through ration books and bond drives. Beneath the polished slogans, something darker thrived. Wartime black markets. And that's where the story turns. Chapter 4. Why black markets boomed. While posters preached sacrifice, picture this. Giant posters on city walls scream, "Do with less so they'll have enough." But in back alleys and barns, cash slid across palms for butter, meat, and gasoline. America lived 2 lives at once. Between 1942 and 1945, rationing touched nearly everything. Coffee was capped at 1 pound every 5 weeks per adult. Sugar, just half a pound per person per week. Gasoline rationing cut most families down to 3 gallons a week. That meant no Sunday drives, no unnecessary trips. But here's where it gets wild. Demand didn't vanish just because stamps were short. Entire underground markets bloomed. In 1943, federal investigators uncovered a single black market meat ring in Chicago that moved 2 million pounds of beef without ration stamps. Farmers quietly sold extra eggs or pork to neighbors off the books. Truck drivers siphoned gas and resold it. A pound of butter rationed at 60 cents could fetch over $1 on the street. Some even forged ration coupons. By 1944, counterfeit stamp seizures topped $5 million worth. The government cracked down hard. One Detroit butcher was fined $10,000 for hoarding meat, a fortune then. In New York, agents raided warehouses filled with stolen sugar sacks, destined for bakeries willing to pay double. But here's the irony. While propaganda urged sacrifice, many families believed the black market was the only way to survive. One Connecticut mother recalled, "Without the neighbor's extra pork, my children would have gone hungry." So while patriotic posters painted a clean picture of unity, reality was messier. Patriotism often wrestled with hunger. But here's the bigger question. When official supplies couldn't meet daily needs, who stepped in? Chapter 5. The National Sacrifice Mindset. Would we accept it today? Close your eyes and picture it. 1943, Main Street, America. Store shelves half empty, ration books in every pocket, and slogans like, "Use it up, wear it out, make it do," or "do without," painted on posters. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a survival rule. Victory gardens became the front lawn trend. They weren't hobby projects. By 1944, 20 million gardens produced nearly 40% of all vegetables grown in the U.S. Imagine almost half the nation's food coming not from stores, but from backyards, parks, and churchyards. Families canned everything: beans, carrots, tomatoes, stacked in glass jars that sometimes lined entire basements. Clothes, patched until threadbare. Shoes were resoled again and again. Nylon stockings gone to make parachutes. Women painted lines up their legs with eyebrow pencils to mimic seams. It wasn't fashion, it was patriotism. Luxury goods disappeared. In 1942, new cars stopped rolling off assembly lines because Detroit was building tanks and bombers. Families shared rides, walked to work, or relied on victory bicycles. Even Hollywood stars joined in. Rita Hayworth posed with scrap drives, and Bing Crosby urged people to ration sugar. Sacrifice wasn't embarrassing. It was a badge of honor. Blackouts at night meant no glowing city skylines, just darkened streets to fool enemy bombers. Curtains were pinned shut, porch lights off. Children grew up believing silence and shadow were part of patriotism. And yet, people accepted it. Not easily, but they did. Polls from 1943 show that over 80% of Americans supported rationing, even as grumbling filled kitchens. Why? Because the mindset was drilled deep. Sacrifice meant survival, not just for families, but for soldiers overseas. Now here's the uncomfortable question. If TikTok stars and Instagram influencers told us today to cut sugar, skip new clothes, and grow beans in the yard, would anyone listen? That uneasy thought leads us into the next chapter. How the government stopped runaway prices when goods vanished from shelves, and why inflation didn't explode the way you might expect. Chapter 6. Why inflation didn't explode. Despite scarcity, picture a grocery store in 1943. The shelves aren't empty, but what's left is rationed, counted, and tracked. Butter? Only half a pound per person per week. Sugar? Limited to 8 ounces weekly. Coffee? Restricted to 1 pound every 5 weeks. Gasoline? Stamped coupons allowed 3 gallons a week for civilians. In short, everything was scarce. And yet, prices didn't spiral out of control the way we might expect today. While modern supply shocks send inflation skyrocketing, wartime America kept inflation at around 3.5% per year on average between 1941 and 1945. How? Strict, almost brutal, government controls. The Office of Price Administration, OPA, created in 1941, set legal price ceilings on over 90% of retail goods. A loaf of bread had a maximum price. A gallon of milk had a maximum price. Even rent in major cities was frozen at early 1940s levels. If grocers charged more, they risked fines, ration book suspensions, or public shaming in the local paper. Of course, this didn't stop people from trying to cheat. Black markets exploded. In New York, a pound of steak worth 40 cents officially sold under the table for over $1.50. Some gas stations cut deals with A sticker holders to secretly sell extra gallons. One OPA official even admitted, "For every rule, there's a scheme to break it." But for most Americans, rationing worked because it spread scarcity fairly. Everyone, rich or poor, got the same coupons. You couldn't buy extra sugar, even if you had the money. In a strange way, it forced equality at the grocery counter. Still, here's the twist. Even with rules, families got creative. Some stretched butter with mashed potatoes, others watered down milk, and millions turned to Victory Gardens, which, as we saw earlier, supplied nearly half the nation's vegetables, blunting what could have been food inflation chaos. So here's the question. Would people today accept a world where the government, not the free market, told you what a gallon of gas or a loaf of bread should cost? That question leads straight into the next chapter, when thrift itself became fashionable and frugality turned into a strange new kind of social status. Chapter 7. When sacrifice turned into status. Imagine this. Stockings vanish overnight. Nylon, once a cheap luxury, is now redirected to parachutes and ropes for the war effort. Women, instead of going bare-legged, paint seams down the backs of their calves with eyebrow pencils, imitating stockings that no longer exist. And here's the surprise. Nobody laughed. Instead, this act of thrift became fashionable. During World War II, frugality wasn't shameful. It was patriotic. In 1942, magazines like Life and Ladies' Home Journal printed guides on how to make do beautifully. They taught women how to repurpose old dresses into blouses or dye curtains into skirts. A 1943 Good Housekeeping article even bragged that clever wives can stretch a single dress across 5 different occasions. Car sharing became another badge of honor. Gasoline rationing limited most civilians to 3 gallons per week, barely enough for work commutes. So neighbors pooled rides. What today might be seen as embarrassing, sharing a car, was then celebrated as communal duty. Families displayed car club stickers in their windows with pride. Even Hollywood joined in. Actress Rita Hayworth posed for photos endorsing fabric conservation. Bing Crosby publicly praised his wife for mending his socks. In fact, U.S. War Advertising Council campaigns actively glamorized thrift, pushing slogans like, "Do with less, so they'll have enough." The culture shifted so far that saving became a form of social status. People bragged about having the smallest electric bill or the cleverest food substitutes. Housewives swapped recipes for meatless meals, like liver loaf, carrot marmalade, or peanut butter stuffed peppers. What once signaled poverty suddenly symbolized patriotism. But here's where it gets really fascinating. Scarcity didn't just inspire pride. It reshaped identity. A survey in 1944 found that 73% of Americans believed sacrifice made them stronger citizens. Imagine that today. Would people Instagram their ration meals with hashtags of pride? That paradox takes us right into the final mystery. If thrift and sacrifice became a badge of honor, then what lasting whispers did World War II's economy leave behind for us now? Chapter 8. What World War II's economy still whispers to us. The war ended in 1945, but its financial lessons never left the kitchen tables of America. And here's the part most people miss. Those lessons quietly shaped the post-war boom, the savings culture of the 1950s, and even the way we think about money today. During the war, ration books and price controls had conditioned families to live with less. Housewives mastered substitution. They learned how to cook without sugar, stretch a pound of meat into 3 meals, or mend clothes until they were unrecognizable. By 1944, 40% of all vegetables eaten in America came from victory gardens, a staggering figure that turned ordinary backyards into national food security. Doesn't that sound eerily like today's push toward community gardens and urban farming? But the war didn't only change diets, it changed gender roles. With over 16 million men in uniform, women took charge of family budgets and the workforce. By 1945, nearly 1 in 4 married women worked outside the home, managing both wages and ration coupons. That budgeting power carried forward. By the 1950s, women controlled 75% of household spending decisions in the U.S. savings culture, also hardened. Between 1941 and 1945, Americans purchased $185 billion in war bonds, the equivalent of over $3 trillion today. For many families, it was their first experience in structured investing. War bonds weren't optional. They were marketed as patriotic duty. Posters screamed, "If you can't go across, come across." That mindset planted the idea that financial sacrifice was a civic responsibility, not just a personal choice. Yet beneath the pride lurked shadows. Black markets thrived. Coffee, meat, gasoline, all rationed, all sold under the table. One 1943 report estimated 1/3 of all meat in New York City was traded illegally. And that whisper of human nature, of bending rules when survival's at stake, still echoes in every economic crisis. So what does World War II really tell us? That communities can endure rationing, sacrifice, and even enforce thrift. But only if the majority believes the struggle means something greater than themselves. Now here's the harder question. If tomorrow ration books returned, would we accept it? Or would the system collapse in chaos? If you've stayed this far, you're one of the few who truly care about the hidden money lessons from World War II. Don't miss what's next. Subscribe now, because our next story uncovers an even darker financial secret history tried to erase.